New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to examine magic and the legacy of Aleister Crowley. With me is Gary Lachman, a regular guest. Gary is a historian of esoteric culture. He is the author of some 20 books on thinkers in the field of mysticism and the occult, including Emanuel Swedenborg, Rudolf Steiner, Helena Blavatsky, P.D. Ouspensky. He's written about the Hermetic tradition and about the power of imagination. Once again, this interview is being conducted via the internet, as Gary is an American living in London. So now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And the interesting thing about our discussion today concerning Aleister Crowley and the esoteric movements that he was involved in is that we were both in our youth and involved with a subculture in which Aleister Crowley was largely regarded as a heroic figure.
Oh, certainly. When I first was getting in to all the sort of thing that I've been writing about for quite some time now, Crowley was one of the first people that I came across. This was in 1975. And it was when I was first living in New York, and I was first playing in a band that would soon, become very well known, Blondie. And I was living. I mean, I've told the story in practically every interview, but it just so happens to be the case. So here we go again. But I was living in a loft space on the Bowery with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein, obviously the singer and the guitar player, and they had a kind of fun pop interest in a lot of this sort of stuff. So, there was a few upside down pentagrams around and candles and that kind of thing. And, but where we were living in this loft space on the Bowery, there was this very wild flamboyant artist who was very interested in Crowley. And I was particularly interested in Crowley's Thoth Tarot deck, which at the time was still relatively rare. It was available, but not everybody had one. And
I owned a copy.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't seen anything like this before. And he would do these impromptu readings, or he was also doing these big sort of paintings based on the figures in the tarot deck. And if you know the Crowley tarot deck, it's this beautiful, fantastic, work of art, actually. And I just got very interested in it. I mean, it's around the same time I started reading Colin Wilson, his book, The Occult. And he had a long chapter on Crowley in there. And he just became fascinating, for me. And so that was sort of the springboard into all of this sort of stuff back then. And the interesting thing is that he remains an esoteric figure that has his own place in pop culture as well. I mean, my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, was about the occult revival in the 1960s. And by the late 60s, people like Jung and Madame Blavatsky and some others were turning up in the pop context and music and all that. But they didn't sort of linger on as icons, this much overused word, as Crowley did. So, I mean, Crowley today is still part of the pop culture, in rap music and all that kind of thing. So it was just interesting that my first encounter with him wasn't, I didn't meet some emissary of a secret society, and I wasn't on my own esoteric quest. I was playing in a rock band in New York, and these books are hanging around, and then also because he was interested in drugs and all that, so that was sort of the other kind of interest. But yeah, this was something that happened at the very beginning.
Now, it strikes me that Crowley today would be widely regarded as a teacher of esoteric subjects, but I don't think anybody would call him a spiritual teacher.
Well, he has his own peculiar way of thinking about those things, but yeah, I wouldn't use the word spiritual in the way we usually use it to apply to him. Although he himself, I'm sure, at different times. I mean, he said he was a hell of a holy guru and things of that sort. But no, he was much more the dark side. But he wasn't evil. I mean, that's one of the things I've tried to make out in the book. He just was very thick-headed. I mean, he was oblivious of other people. And, you can see that happening in his childhood and all this. And this was this kind of almost autistic kind of disregard for the reality that was around him. And, I mean, I don't mean to reduce all of his ideas about magic to something along those lines, but I think there is sort of an element of it in there. But no, he wasn't evil. He just was very, just oblivious of other people, and this freed him up to do a lot of things a lot of other people don't get around to doing. And this is another reason why he became a hero, because he had this adventurous life. He was a mountain climber and he explored and traveled and all this sort of thing. So, for someone like myself, I was 19 when I came across this, and out in the world, really on my own, in the sense of just charging out and doing things. So this philosophy of the will, do it without wilt, and all of this was, it was very fascinating and very motivating.
Also, a very key part of Crowley's esoteric development centers around a particular magical operation, the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin, the mage, translated by one of Crowley's own, I guess you might say, a mentor or a guru, S.L. McGregor Mathers, who was one of the founders of the Order of the Golden Dawn in England, a very influential esoteric organization that Crowley became deeply involved with. That's a very important part of the story. And I might mention parenthetically that back in about 1969, I encountered that same book, and I had that ambition to perform that magical ritual myself, which I never did. But because I at one time had that ambition, I'm rather familiar with it.
Well, it is one of the real major magical operations, and it's actually more, it's more meditative. I mean, I never did it. I've read it. Again, this was one of the books that was actually available back then in New York at the time when a lot of these old occult books were put out in these cheap editions. So, I'd come across that and all that. And yes, and this was the thing. It takes like 6 months, and you have to have all these preparations, and you have to find, the right place to do it and secluded. And again, it's a much more sort of meditative sort of kind of thing. And I do remember there was one book out in the 70s where someone had kept a diary of doing it. I don't remember the title or the author now, but I do remember there was one account of someone who actually went through it the whole way. But again, this was something that Crowley started and then stopped and didn't continue, and put off at different times. Or he claims to have worked on it interiorly when he was doing this walk across China. At one point, I write about that in the book, when he was sort of on horseback, and he wanted to complete, some of the ritual, and it was sort of, well, I could go back, put myself back mentally, or I could just do it here in some way. And he sort of talks about doing it on the horseback, but I don't know if it really counts and all that. But still, this was something that he started and then stopped. And later people said, oh, this is why things went bad for him, because you didn't complete this. And, whatever powers that you were sort of invoking, you didn't, learn to master and so on.
Well, I guess the ultimate question is, and we'll get to this in the course of our discussion, is how successful was he as a so-called magician in the ancient sense of the term, considering that he inherited a fortune. He blew through his fortune before he was, I suppose, around 40, probably well before he was 40, and lived much of his life in poverty, and one might say in misery. He became a heroin addict. It hardly seems like the career of a great yogi.
Well, you don't have to be a magician to blow a fortune quickly. I mean, there's lots of people that do that. But yeah, he did devote a good amount of that to that. And I mean, this was the thing with Crowley. There is a sense where he had everything handed to him, and this was one of the worst things for him. That I mean, obviously, there's very serious interpretations of his philosophy of Thelema, do what thou will. And it's too easy to say, well, that just really turns into do what you want. And I don't mean to reduce it to that, but at the same time, it's difficult to not see where Crowley, justified a lot of, just basically getting things the way he wanted them to be, in terms of this philosophy. But this was, he himself, well, again, it all depends how you want to judge being successful at magic. I mean, there are many of the great, magicians in the past have not had particularly good lives. They've all had sort of troubled lives. Madame Blavatsky, she was a character. She wasn't like Crowley, this sort of wickedest man in the world. But she had a life where she went through a lot of suffering, a lot of trouble. She was attacked for being a fraud and things of that sort. And if you look back at other magicians through the ages, not too many of them had very nice, peaceful sort of lives. And that does seem to be something that's, part of the tradition in some way. It never seems to profit the magician themselves, although, I don't know, how successful was Crowley? I mean, we're talking about him now. So there were a lot of people who back then who, they didn't have this life, and they kept to the straight and narrow, and we don't know anything about them, but they had happier lives. So he's successful enough, I think, in what he wanted to do was basically being known. Again, this was another huge motivation behind him, was this sense that he had this huge ego, and again, rightly so, because he was brilliant, he was talented, but he knew it. And he made sure everybody else knew it. And he didn't have the brakes on that sort of thing that many people do, or the ones that you need, I would say, in order to, be able to really, edit your own work so that you just don't think everything you write is genius. And again, this was, he grew up in this strange combination of this repressive Christian fundamentalist family, the Plymouth Brethren, who really believed the end of the world was coming and a new age was coming, much like Crowley himself would say in his own, philosophy. And but they were very dour, and they didn't celebrate Christmas or birthdays and things of that sort. But then his father, although he wasn't a brewer himself, he inherited this brewery and this whole chain of basically sort of pubs, Crowley ale houses, where people would go and have a pint and a sandwich. And then Crowley himself grew up to be a model child of this community. And it wasn't until his father died when he was 11 that Crowley said that he didn't stop believing in God and Jesus. He just went over to the other side. He decided, he had spent, I guess, all his childhood, sort of emulating Jesus and trying to do the good things. And his father was a preacher, and he went throughout the land, and he had pamphlets that he wrote, promoting the Plymouth Brethren creed. Again, much like Crowley himself would do with his own philosophy and with Thelema, his own religion, that kind of thing. But then he went over to the other side, and then he became, the child from hell. He's not Satanist in the sense that most of us understand Satan, but he does say in his autohagiography that basically I went over to the devil's side, and he became what I called an impossibilist. That's what he wanted to. He took on all of the things that no one said. People said you couldn't do, and he was going to prove that he could do it. And he had this persistence in doing things like that.
You often refer to Nietzsche in your descriptions of Crowley, that he's something of a Nietzschean anti-hero.
Well, this would be, again, one of the common things we would say. He was sort of a Nietzschean character in the sense that he was the Superman, or he wanted to be a Superman, and he was above common humanity, which again, yes, it's a Nietzschean trope, but it gets very sort of popularized and sort of turned into something else. But no, I mean Crowley certainly felt that he was, he wasn't a Democrat, a socialist. He certainly felt he was above the crowd, the masses, and all this sort of thing. And I mean, the first thing, he first rebelled against his family, or against his family background, his mother, with sex. That was the first thing that really, sent him off. And this has sort of stayed with him for the rest of his life. But later, when he inherited the fortune, this is when he could indulge in, the sex, but also the drugs at the time, and writing his poetry and living the life of something like Baudelaire, or, the sort of, if you know this fantastic novel called Against Nature by Huysmans, where it's this fantastic decadent aesthete who creates this whole world of beauty around him and strange desires, and so Crowley's sort of doing that. He's spending all this money, decorating his room and all this kind of thing, and then paying for these volumes of his poetry to be published. So I mean, that's his first kind of love, is this sort of sex and poetry, and then he comes across magic. He comes across the whole idea of magic, and he reads in a book by A.E. Waite, which one version of which was called the Book of Black Magics and Pacts. This notion of this strange kind of hidden brotherhood, this hidden church, which really comes from this Christian mystic of the 18th century, Karl von Eckartshausen. And it's this kind of hidden church, this kind of secret, invisible, sort of Rosicrucian idea. And Crowley, he wants to join them. Where can he find them? And that begins his search. And then he meets this fellow when he's mountain climbing, and he realizes that he knows about alchemy and all this kind of thing. And this whole story where he's racing through the mountains trying to find him, before he gets away. And this is eventually how he, comes to London and joins the Golden Dawn.
I think it's fair to say that by the time he joined the Golden Dawn, he had already established himself as a credible person in the field of mountain climbing, and probably a credible minor poet.
Well, some would say he was an incredibly minor poet, but I'll pass on that joke. But no, he was certainly known as a mountain climber. I mean, he certainly has achievements. I mean, and I mean, I think today there's a rehabilitation about him. It certainly is. I know in London, if you go to National Gallery, there's a portrait of Crowley there, and it's a mountain climber and poet. And then down at the bottom, it's sort of occultist, this kind of thing. So it's very, it's strange, but that's the thing. I mean, eventually, all of the weird people in England just become sort of national treasures. You start out as an eccentric, and then over time you become a national treasure, and then you're neutralized. And so, but no, he certainly made 2 attempts on the Himalayas, and one was absolutely disastrous, and that ruined his career, where he failed to come to the aid of his fellow climbers in this mood of "I told you so." Because there was this contrast between them, and he was leading the party, but they didn't like the way he was treating the locals, who were sort of working for them. He was sort of showing them who was the boss, basically. So Crowley had a sadistic streak too, and he had this character where he had to sort of show them, the British are here, or something along that kind of thing. And so the other climbers they got sick of this. And then they said they were going to go, down the mountain. And he said, no, if you go now, you'll never make it. And I mean, he was very good. He knew, and he had instincts, and he had this whole peculiar, eccentric way of climbing, which was the way he did practically everything. But what happened was exactly what he said. They came into trouble, and he could hear their cries for help, but he stayed in his tent. And I mean, this was the sort of thing. I mean, and he later exonerated himself and justified this. He was a master at. I mean, I don't mean to say all these bad things about him, but he was. This was the bad side of him, which sadly was quite a bit, where he was able to justify everything he was doing and all that. But and I say in my book, I said, if you really were a Superman, that would be the time to show it. You go out the door, and you do, no matter whether you can save them or not, but you're there, rather than sort of just sitting in your tent and thinking, "I told you so." But that ended his career. But he had some very notable accomplishments. I mean, he was very good at what he did. He did lots of things. But he, like I said, he wasn't a good editor, so he basically let himself get away with everything all the time.
Well, let's talk about the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was so important in his career.
Well, this was next to the Theosophical Society, I would say, probably the most important occult or magical organization in the late 19th century. That was sort of its heyday. It more or less fell apart after Crowley got involved. But this was something that there's different stories of how it started, but the main sort of story is that one of the original members found this manuscript in a used bookshop over in a part of London called Farringdon. Within it was sort of within a book, and then the manuscript came out, and it was in German, and it was written by a Fräulein Sprengler, and it came out that this was sort of instructions for initiating an order of a magical society known as the Golden Dawn, and so eventually it was Wynne Westcott, William Woodman, I think was the other, and Mathers, who you mentioned. They were the original three. And it was basically a kind of hierarchical, it's not Masonic, Rosicrucian, I guess, is what they would call them, or they did call themselves. But it was basically a hierarchical system of magical initiation and learning, more or less following the Kabbalah, the path that you would go up. So there were different levels, sort of, you were the initial, then one, then so on and so on. And the way it was, there was sort of different sort of sections. Students could only get so high, and then you had to go through a certain initiation to get into the next sort of level. And it was that sort of thing that led to the kind of breakup when Crowley got involved. Because, as I said, Crowley was in the mountains, and he had met this fellow who knew about alchemy, and he tracked him down, and then he said, well, I'll introduce you to the people when we get to London. And then so he was introduced, and he was initiated in Mark Mason's hall, and I forget the exact date right now. And it had already been going on for quite some time. And one of the big members at the time was the poet W.B. Yeats, who had already been in the Theosophical Society and continued in different sort of versions of the Golden Dawn after this the whole thing blew up around this time. And there's this famous story of Crowley and Yeats, and yes, Crowley had published, self-published his poetry, but Yeats was a recognized sort of legitimate poet. And Crowley tells a story where he showed Yeats some of his poetry, and what he wanted from Yeats was, hail fellow, well met. Yes, brother poet. And yes, I see, you're a genius and all this sort of thing. And what actually happened was Yeats looked at it, and I guess he just mumbled some, kind of polite, kind of compliments or something. And this was not what Crowley had wanted to hear. And he said that he knew immediately why, Yeats reacted in this way, is that he could recognize that his poetry was so great. Crowley's poetry was so great that Yeats would never be able to match it. So this was sort of, this kind of the way. I mean, it's understandable. Why not? If you think you're good, why not? And all that. I mean, the other story along these sorts of lines is, Crowley talks about the part of England, where he was born, Leamington Spa, and he said, isn't it sort of odd that I'm paraphrasing it, that some one spot of England should produce two of England's greatest poets, and because we should not forget Shakespeare. They were both born, and so this was again, and it's funny. I mean, I think he's at his best when you allow him to do this, and this is why his Confessions of Aleister Crowley, I think, is one of his best books, and it's very funny. He tells lots of great stories. He's a great raconteur, and he's amusing. You can go on at length, but he is able to do that.
He seemed to have a sense of humor about himself when he refers to his autobiography as an autohagiography. You can tell that's tongue in cheek.
Yeah. I mean, no. Again, he did have a very good sense of humor. I was going to say he could be charming, and I guess this is sort of the magical side as well. I mean, he knew how to use humor, and he also, I guess you could say he used it as a teaching strategy. He adds people like Madame Blavatsky did and Gurdjieff did, in different sorts of ways. They were sort of pranksters or tricksters, and they did, they made things uncomfortable for the people around them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly something Crowley did. But what had happened is that he had, there was already a tension going on in the Golden Dawn because Mathers, by this time, was living in Paris. And he claimed to be the only one who was in contact with the secret chiefs. And the secret chiefs are this sort of like the equivalent of Blavatsky's masters, along the same lines. They're these hidden figures that they're supernatural, they're human, but they have super, human powers, basically. And Mathers tells us, he relates how sort of having an audience with them is you can describe it as sort of like being near a lightning bolt and the smell of ether. I mean, having not had that combination myself, I don't quite know exactly what he means, but I get some idea. And he talks about meeting him in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris and things of that sort. But he was the only one who had direct contact with them. And this whole story about how the secret chiefs are fraud and all that kind of thing that's always in the background of these kind of occult goings on. But that was his story, and he was having a contrast with the London group. And so he was in Paris, and he was studying at the Library d'Arsenal and so on. And he was married to the philosopher Henri Bergson's sister, by the way, Moina Bergson. So that's another interesting parenthetical thing there. And what had happened is when the Yeats group in London here, they refused Crowley this initiation. They didn't because nobody liked him. They felt he was a troublemaker. Yeats just certainly didn't like him. He didn't have a good word for him, and neither did Crowley have a good word for Yeats. I mean, he tears him apart in his novel Moonchild. He has this horrible kind of poison pen pastiche of Yeats in there, but Crowley does, and he just ups and goes to Paris. And Mathers is looking for an ally now because there's factionalism going on. And so he gives Crowley the initiation.
Let's talk a bit about what this process involves being initiated in the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Well, I mean, there's different levels of, if you know the Tree of Life, there's Malkuth and Yesod, and then Hod and Netzach and Tiferet, and then that's sort of the first kind of level. And that's sort of within, I don't want to say, you can do that without meeting the secret chiefs, put it that way. So that's sort of self-development, and there's various different practices and rituals and exercises, and you visualize.
For example, they had robes, they wore costumes.
Oh yeah. I mean, that was I mean, there was all that. There was all. I'm saying that's sort of the Masonic or the regalia. I mean, it was a whole ceremony. Yes, and based on a variety of Egyptian and Kabbalistic and Hermetic. Magical, ideas and philosophies and so on. You do certain practices, you exercises, and you have to study and that kind of thing. And by the time Crowley he was a quick learner, but by the time he joined, he already knew most of the stuff that, the lower levels. I forget the exact names of the different titles, but there's different kind of, grades that you get that are related to the spheres on the Tree of Life. And then sort of into the next sphere he wanted to go, and they just didn't, no matter how much he knew or whatever, they just didn't like him, and they didn't think he really deserved, he was very pushy and all this kind of thing, so they didn't think he deserved going up to the next level of initiation. So he went through the initiation there with Mathers, and so Mathers, being the head of the society, that should have done it, but he basically, Mathers sent Crowley back to London to take over the temple, and this was sort of a famous battle that took place over in Hammersmith, the west side of London, where Crowley shows up, and he's in sort of Highland garb, and he's got a dagger and a black mask, and he also has got two kind of heavies brawler types that he's picked up, in Soho or somewhere, they say like that. And he's gone there to sort of take possession of the temple. And it just turns into this fracas, it just turns into this strange kind of weird, thing that goes on, and the police Bobby comes by and all that kind of thing. It's almost like a Monty Python. You can imagine as a Monty Python kind of episode. But it turned into the Battle of Blythe Road. That's what it was called. And that's kind of like sets the Golden Dawn sort of fractures after that. And then Crowley himself goes off on his own adventures for a while, and then he comes back, and then he sort of takes down Mathers. He and Mathers have a kind of battle.
In effect, a magical duel.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing. I mean, he was. Yeah, I mean, it's much of it is about power. I mean, Yeats wasn't really like this in that way. I mean, Mathers was another sort of will-dominated kind of character, a very driven personality, and he was completely devoted, to magic. And I mean, and it worked. I mean, it's not just madness going on in these people's minds. As you know, I mean, these things can work, and there are these strange kind of powers and capacities that we can somehow break through into. Through some kind of extreme, concentration of will. But you do have to be a character that can do that. And as we say, there's this like an almost autistic character to Crowley, where he could focus his, and he would just do it to prove a point. And this was something that in one sense is admirable, but it could be, very, something, very boring, not boring, but I mean, it just sort of drive you out of your mind after a while. But yeah, so Crowley, he has a battle with Mathers as well. And eventually he decides to set up his own magical society.
And now, I guess it's important to point out that he was involved in a number of different organizations. For example, there's one known as the OTO, into which he was initiated, and it's still known today as an organization devoted to the practice of sexual magical rituals.
Yeah, this was something a bit down the line. I mean, in between that and the Golden Dawn, he started something called the Order of the Silver Star, or Agentium Astrum, or the AA, and it was his own kind of Golden Dawn. And but I mean, he did a lot of interesting stuff with that. One of the most well-known episodes was when he put on a version of the Lucian Mysteries, and at the same time, where he was handing around this beverage that had peyote and a variety of other kind of intoxicating substances in it, and the people at the time, were writing about it in the newspapers and all that. This was sort of the thing that was giving him a bad reputation. But the OTO happened is that Crowley had written a book called The Book of Lies. And this is sort of where his sense of humor and his brilliance kind of worked against him, because if you didn't know his philosophy, and if you didn't know Kabbalah, and you didn't know a variety of other rather arcane esoteric sorts of things, you're not going to get many of the kind of references that he makes in this book. And it's a book of sort of, sort of aphorisms, or it's like, just something on a page, or maybe even 2 lines or something like that. But there are these strange kind of puzzles, or like Zen koans, or something along those lines. But one day there's a knock on his door, and this fellow Theodore Royce turns up, and he's one of the high-ranking members in the OTO, which is the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the order of the Oriental Temple. And he basically comes to complain to Crowley that Crowley has given away, the secrets of their order. And Crowley doesn't know, what he's talking about. And he said, well, it's a secret to me as well. And so Royce opens up the book and he points to it. And it's a particular passage where Crowley is talking about having, the magical rod and the mystic rose and so on and so on. And it turns out that Royce is saying, well, the OTO, as you say, is a magical group that's devoted to practice of sexual magic. And it goes back to the ancient Templars, or at least that's the idea that it does. And Crowley thought, well, I've been, mad about sex since I've been 11 years old, or whatever it was, 13. I didn't know I was doing magic at the same time, and I do magic too, but, you put them together? And it's like, wow. And it was sort of like it was a revelation to him that, you could use sex for magic. I mean, he was still doing, even though he was sort of experimenting with doing sort of the magical ceremonies in different ways. I mean, you start out with all the robes and all that. And as I say, he kind of, this one time on horseback when he was going, across China, he was doing it in his head. It's, in a way, that kind of is the beginning of what later became known as chaos magic, where you sort of use whatever's at hand kind of thing. So, but he was still doing ceremony in some kind of way, and working up, the excitement, the enthusiasm during the ceremony to charge the magical, the will and the imagination. But he said, "Oh God, you can use sex to do that." And then he said, "Well, sure. Well, I want to join," basically. And then his own, prestige and brilliance and genius and all that quickly led him to become, in the end, sort of the head of the order and all that kind of thing. And yes, it's still around today. I know a few people that are involved, and they're all very nice people, and they take it seriously. There's websites and there's different groups. But there's one, I think, officially recognized kind of group these days, but there is a kind of infighting, which is generally, happens with all these kinds of things. But yeah, it's still here. I mean, in his last days, Crowley in the late 40s, he was being supported by mostly by donations from the OTO chapter in Pasadena, and this was the famous one that Jack Parsons, who was the rocket scientist, where he was a rocket scientist by day, but a Crowley magician by night. And the OTO chapter that he belonged to was sending Crowley care packages, to keep him going.
Founder of Caltech.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I haven't seen it, but I think there was a TV or whatever online show or Amazon show called Dark Angel. I think was something about that as well. So it's a part of the Crowley world that has kind of permeated the popular culture.
And there's also a link there when you mention Jack Parsons with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology.
Well, I mean, the story is that Hubbard learned everything he knew about making Scientology from, being involved in Parsons, Crowley, coven, as it were. And that's a whole other story. I mean, that's a fabulous story. And, but Hubbard, I guess, in a way, he's a Crowleyan character in the sense that he's, he's very big and he does everything his way, and he has this kind of power and he dominates. And I mean, again, this Crowley identified with Ayn Rand, or he had, and one of the last days he read The Fountainhead and he identified with Howard Rourke, and again you could see this kind of basically the powerful individual, not held back by the limits of society and so on and so on. And it's a common trope. You can find it in different places. I mean, some people have associated Trump with Crowley, sort of the kind of, because the Howard Rourke, because Trump was a reader of The Fountainhead and identified with Rourke as well, and he can be seen as a kind of magician, but let's not go there.
Well,
I think we did that one already.
There's also this sense that I get of Crowley sort of identifying with the British upper class at a time when the British Empire was probably the largest empire the world had ever known. And, I think a lot of his arrogance comes out of that milieu, which wasn't so uncommon in his era.
No, I mean, in many ways, I mean, he wanted to be recognized as, a British gentleman. I mean, I think he's finally got it now. I mean, he finally belongs to the club that wouldn't, have him as a member. As I said, he's become sort of neutralized and part of the British tradition. He's a grand old man, well, in many ways he is so. But at the time, well, again, it's a play on words, but, in the 1920s, he was known as the man we'd like to hang. Yeah. But, like that, not he is hung now. He's hung in the National Gallery, but or the wickedest man in the world. And this was when all the scandal was around him. It was building up already when he was living in England. But one reason is that he needed to get out of England, and he also wanted to find a place where he could set up his own kind of community. Again, another kind of magical community. And this is where he has this place in Sicily, in Cefalu, called the Abbey of Thelema, the Abbey of Do What Thou Wilt. Thelema is a Greek word, for will, and it's also the motto in Rabelais' writing as well, where he has a similar sort of abbey. And you can find in other people, Augustine and William Blake and so on. But Crowley, this is what he makes into his philosophy. And this, we haven't even talked about the revelation that he has in Cairo in 1904 when he's there with his first wife. And this is where he has sort of channeled or communicated to him spiritually the text of this book called the Book of the Law, which was the gospel of his religion. I mean, he had already tried to set up something called Crowleyanity. But the Thelema, this was something that didn't come from him. It was given to him like any holy scripture or something along those lines. And in many ways, it's a very interesting text. It is very much of its time. It's very much like the poetry he would like to write, even though he said it's communicated to him from Aiwass, who's extra dimensional intelligence and all that sort of thing. But it's very much along the kinds of thing that Crowley would write himself. So, but it's this philosophy of Thelema, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. He sets up a community, or tries to, in this sort of house he buys in Sicily in the 1920s. And he writes about it in his novel Diary of a Drug Fiend, which is one of the first ones I read. And this is it's readable. I mean, it's very much of its time, but it's readable. And but it's very much an advertisement for the Abbey of Thelema. And it's funny because in the book it's about two people that are basically hooked on cocaine, and they go to the Abbey in order to basically break their addiction, break their habit. And Crowley maintains, or the Crowley character in the book maintained, you could do this by sheer will. So there's sort of piles of the stuff all around, and you could take it or leave it. And but if you develop your will, you'd be able to control it and all this. And all the while he's writing it, he knows this isn't true because he's writing it in London at the he's dictating it at this incredible speed to his Scarlet Woman, Leah Herzig at the time, and they're both knocking it back. According to all the stories, in order to keep going, to write this book about, basically how you get off drugs. And, pressed to do it, he just did it. And it's, I said, I think he wrote it in 6 weeks or something like that. So it's, for something of its nature to be written in short time shows it pressed he could do it. But eventually this place, was his downfall because, there's a variety of stories of different people being there. But in the end, someone who was there who died, Crowley really wasn't responsible, but still the whole kind of aura, the atmosphere that created it around there, and which the newspapers created when the tabloids.
This is where he starts to develop the reputation as the wickedest man in the world.
Well, this is what they call him or there's one particular tabloid that calls him that. I think it's John Bull. And or the man we'd like to hang and all that. And, it just basically, for the average person, what he's doing is kind of weird. He's basically they're taking lots of drugs, they're having lots of sex, they're doing a variety of magical, rituals. He paints these very strange, gruesome, morbid, depending on your taste, transgressive, magical, erotic, paintings on his Chamber of Nightmares and things of that sort. There's stories of bestiality and, or maybe, the real story is that they tried, there's one story, I'm just not to get too graphic, but there's one story where there's tried to be a mating between one of the, the initiates and a goat, but, the goat wasn't up to it, as it were. And so, it's funny in some ways, and it's actually, I can't imagine no one's made a film of it yet, because if you just take it out of the context, it's a fantastic thing that goes on. Because a lot of artists showed up, and some people go there and they actually have a revelation. And somehow, the environment. There's a famous story of this American actress at the time. Again, it's in the 1920s, a woman named Jane Wolfe, who was sort of a character actress, and she was in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. It was an early silent film, but she was, sort of exhausted from the Hollywood rat race and all this kind of thing, and she got into and actually she's in the background of the Parsons, excuse me, the Parsons set up there. She's one of the early kind of people in California that are somehow into Crowley. And any case, she hears about the Abbey, and so she decides to go. And when she first gets there, Crowley tells her to do is he says he takes her to this sort of peak, that's off from where the temple is, from where the Abbey is, and there's a lean-to, and he gives her a robe, and she said, well, every day someone will come and they'll bring you some bread or fruit or something like that, and you have the sky, the earth, the sun, the sea, you have all around you to entertain you. And so she, okay, great. I came thousands of miles. I could do this in California, basically. And at first, she's like, that's her attitude. She's really sort of angry that this is all that's happening. But then over time, she gradually relaxes, and she gradually, acclimatizes to where she is, and she feels. I guess one day she woke up and yes, that's exactly it. I have the sky. I have the whole world around me. She felt, at one, and this was, someone who actually benefited by. I mean, Crowley, I think he did have an instinct. He had an instinct. This is another thing that made him successful in the sense that, he was able to work his magic with people. He had an instinct for people. It wasn't always right, but he had an instinct. Mm-hmm. And, it worked to his disadvantage sometimes because he always sort of had an instinct for weak people. I think he had an instinct for people that he could dominate in some way easily. There wasn't too many people that he respected, as an equal, or he had some people that, he would, in a way, meet with them socially that weren't into magic or anything like that, and whatever other writers or whoever, interesting characters. But in most of his relationships, it was sort of like he was sort of a dominant character. But I guess that would be natural for a guru or a mage or whatever you want to say. But I think he sort of it was a weakness of his after a while. But he also could see in some people, what they needed. And there was another, someone else who came there. And basically Crowley just explained the unconscious to this sort of middle-aged man who came there, and who lived a whole life of worry and concern and responsibilities and so on and so on. And Crowley just basically told this whole notion of the unconscious and repressed, and you have to let what's been repressed out and all this kind of thing, sort of Freud 101, and it just bang. Mm-hmm. It hit him, and he went and did that, and he had a revelation. So sometimes he hit the bullseye.
His writings on magic, and he wrote extensively about magic, often have a psychological bent to them. He seems to be one of the first people to interpret ancient magical principles in terms of modern psychology.
Well, this is the thing he wanted to do. He wanted to rehabilitate magic as scientifically and philosophically respectable pursuit. And this is what he does. He updates it, very much for the time. And yes, again, it's moving away. I mean, one of his earliest books on magic, Book 4, is he spells out his principles very clearly. And there's not a lot of the kind of this labyrinthine trapdoor kind of trope that you find in the later books, like the book that he said he wrote for everyone to sort of rehabilitate magic in theory and practice. It's not immediately. I mean, I read it several times and actually worked my way through some of the rituals in there and all. This is many years ago, but it's not immediately open and available. But that and when I later read Book 4, I said, okay, this is more straightforward. And so in many ways, if someone asked me, I would say, well, read that one first. I think there's a volume where they're together in all that one. But Book 4 is something he wrote earlier, and then, Magic in Theory and Practice, something he wrote in the late 20s. No, he updates it. He basically introduces, modern psychology. And it's not about, is it real or not? It's about, what do we mean by reality? That sort of thing. And it's about again, you could see behind him, there was this movement away from all of the sort of, more, all of the sort of bits and pieces of the ceremony. It was moving away from all that to more about the imagination and the will. I mean, that's sort of the mid-19th century Eliphas Levi, who Crowley said he was a reincarnation of. It kind of starts with that. Crowley kind of picks up on that, and he does make it more intellectually acceptable. At the same time, trying to keep the whole idea of magic, and you can see equations between Kabbalistic ideas and sort of mathematical ones, and non-Euclidean geometry and Einstein, and much of the stuff that was available at the time. And that earlier period before, let's say, the AA period, earlier, and a little bit earlier than that, Crowley was sort of looking for sort of scientific enlightenment. And there was a period where he was Buddhist for a good stretch, and he sort of put magic aside, and it was all about meditation and all that. And then he put those things together. So again, it is this kind of, you could almost say, postmodern, because he's putting bits and pieces and putting it together in different ways. But the scientific illuminism, I think is what he called it. And this is, a really interesting period, because he's experimenting with consciousness, and it's the sort of thing you can find in William James and other people like that at the time. And he's not onto Thelema yet, and he's not onto the Book of the Law just yet. And so, in a way, that doesn't get in the way. And this is why I think he was very good, because he did have a good scientific mind. Mm-hmm. He was able to sort of break these things down into sort of logical bits and pieces that you could understand and put together. A later thing is this short text about yoga. I think it was originally called Yoga for Yellow Bellies or something like that. That was a series of lectures he gave in the 30s. That's another very good example of this kind of clear prose and very straightforward approach, where something that in many other ways is sort of mystified, he's saying, well, let's demystify it, and here's the nuts and bolts of it. He's very, 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 very good at that.
Let's talk about his concept of the Scarlet Woman. He seemed to need to have for his rituals a particular kind of female, and he went through quite a few of them along the way.
Yes, well, this comes from his early reading of the, the Book of Revelations. The Bible was one of the few books he had to read when he was a kid, basically, and his mother, controlled a lot of his reading, so being an imaginative sort, he grew to like the Book of Revelations, and he began to identify with different characters, and obviously the Beast. He's known as the Great Beast, and the story is his mother, when he turned, when he went over to the dark side, as it were, his mother basically said one day, you're a beast, you're as bad as the beast, and the, whatever, and that, something along those kinds of lines. And some people say the story is apocryphal, and he identified with that. and there's this other character from the Book of Revelations who's the Scarlet Woman, and she rides on the beast and all this sort of thing. And Crowley, and this was a particular kind of woman that Crowley needed for these particular sort of magical ceremonies. I mean, he did magic and sex with other women, but they weren't always the Scarlet Woman. The Scarlet Woman, and she held a certain position. This was the thing too. It wasn't the woman, it was the position. So one could have the position or occupy the position of the Scarlet Woman for a certain amount of time, but things would change. And mostly what would change would be the age of the woman. I don't mean to reduce it just to that, or Crowley's interest in her, but the one who was the longest is this one woman named Leah Heitzek, who he met in New York, and brought back to England with him. She was the one who was in Cefalu, and she basically went through hell with him. Literally. Part of their relationship was this sort of magical kind of, almost S&M kind of relationship, where Crowley's sort of obeisance to her, submission to her, was part of his sort of dying out of his ego and all this kind of thing. And he records this in his diary and all that. But at a certain point, she lost the magical charge, as it were, and she would be replaced by someone else. And I forget how many there were exactly. And I think they occupied the title for different lengths of time. But as you say, there were quite a few. And it was basically someone who would collaborate with him in these different magical rituals having to do with sex, and as something along the lines I just said. And it comes out of his identification with these characters from the Bible. That when he first read it, they basically stayed with him, and he acted it out, for the rest of his life.
You mentioned in your book that probably the most readable book that he's written about magic is called Magic Without Tears. I think it's one of his last books.
Yeah, this is a collection of letters, answers to letters that people had written him over the years, and I think it was originally going to be called Aleister Explains All or something like that. But it's sort of like a correspondence course or a kind of how-to, and it's very readable because it's written in his later life, and he's just very expansive. And again, if you can just accept that the way it's going to be, it's something that you could take as a good introduction to magic, but his particular brand of magic. But it's a very readable last kind of look, gentle walk through these thelemic lanes that he had been mapping out for many years. And the other thing that his book on tarot, the Book of Thought, this is one of the things from Lady Frida Harris, the artist who did the paintings. She and Crowley collaborated in the last years and produced. And again, this is probably, along with Magic and Theory and Practice, this is probably one of the most influential books that he wrote. That's still something that people refer to.
And the tarot deck, I think, is really unusual and beautiful. Truly, it seems to kind of combine, early 20th century modern art with ancient tarot. And I think it does a very elegant job of it.
No, they're fantastic paintings. She had studied projective geometry with people that were students of Rudolf Steiner's. And that's informing, some of the images as well. But they're very vibrant, vital, bright, powerful images, which you could just look at them and meditate on them, even if you didn't know much about the tarot or much about the imagery. They're powerful enough to do that, and they're based on Crowley's sort of directions. I would say that the text follows each of the cards, mostly the trumps and all that sort of thing. And again, he manipulates the cards, so he moves a couple of them around in different places to accommodate his own peculiar Kabbalistic way of reading it and all that. But again, it's a fascinating journey through the tarot, and those images have a real power. So yes, if you haven't seen them, I would go out of my way to find them.
And the Lady Frida Harris, the artist, remained a close friend and confidant and student of Crowley's, and I gather from your book, was not involved with him in terms of any of the sexual rituals.
Oh, no. Well, I think by that time he probably couldn't, do it, and they didn't have that kind of relationship. But no, she. He had quite a few visitors in his last days. He was living in this place called Netherwood, which is an apt name for Crowley's Last Resort, as this book that I contributed to, it was titled about the place. And this is in a place called Hastings, which is on the coast here. It's not far from London, but it was a very interesting kind of boarding house where the people who ran it were artists, or they were theater people, and they wanted to sort of have a place where interesting people could come to for the weekend, and they would meet and talk and have unlike today, they weren't not everybody was on their phone checking social media, so they would, let's go stay at this interesting place over the weekend. And different people were there. Jacob Brunkowski was one of the people there. C.E.M. Joad, he's not well known today, but at the time he was a well-known sort of popular radio kind of philosopher, and a variety of other sort of people from that milieu. And so, having sort of found a perch in a variety of different places. The other thing with Crowley, he was always moving. He was hardly ever in the same place for very, very long. He found, these people he knew, found him a room at this place, and then he was there, and he had, interesting people. Peter Brook, the film director, when he was a very young man, he visited Crowley, and he actually got Crowley to play a part in a production he was doing at the time. E.M. Butler, who was an academic who wrote a great deal about magic and influence on culture, she interviewed him there. Richard Ellman, who was a biographer of Yeats, and other people like that. And there were many other people who came and to see him. and sort of, and he was a very different character then too. He had lost a lot of weight. He was very shrunken. He was more like a Gandalf, kind of magician at the time. But he was still taking an enormous amount of heroin. Yeah. He tried to kick the habit many times, and he couldn't. This was, one of the things that I would say one of the things that he contributed in many ways was his account in the 1920s in North Africa, trying to break his heroin habit. Is a remarkable account, and he doesn't give himself any breaks, and he sort of follows all the the dodges and all the whatever stories he tells himself to give him a reason to have the shot or whatever it is and all that. And I think that's something that probably contribute to just our understanding of addiction itself.
One of the interesting things you mentioned, Peter Brook, the director, as I recall, he directed the film and probably the stage performance of Marat Sade about the Marquis de Sade and the French Revolution. And it strikes me that Crowley is in many ways a character in the same vein as the Marquis de Sade.
Yeah, I guess in the sense that
the antinomian quality.
Yeah, antinomian. Yeah. I think I think you're right. This kind of antinomian character. That was the thing. He was sort of against the rules. He was beyond societal rules, or he understood things. He had a certain vision of the world, and he followed it through. You can find many other kind of characters like that. I think Crowley, he's in the same kind of category in different ways as sort of the surrealists or sort of the beats or, some of the early existentialists or the punks. And they're this is something that I think is just part of our sort of psychology. I call it sort of liberationism, just as a handy way to point to it. There's this whole kind of philosophy of liberation in the sense that if only we can get rid of all of these constraints. You could say it goes back to Rousseau, the whole idea that, we're born free, but it's everywhere in chains. We're natural, we're good, we're perfect, we're pure and pristine, and then it's civilization, society, and its demands that, warps us in some way. And if only we could get rid of that. And, it's a wonderful idea. Wouldn't it be great if that was the case? But it doesn't seem to be the case because all of the attempts to do that don't seem to, result in what you want. And in many ways, the whole kind of anything goes or, complete freedom, absolute freedom in the end turns into its opposite in different sorts of ways. So one of the things I say in the book about Crowley is I say I think we owe him a debt of thanks in many ways because I think he went out into the jungle. He was one of the figures out front with the machete cutting through, the dense undergrowth. And his path kind of was a cul-de-sac. It didn't go, exactly, or it went off in different directions. So we don't have to go that way. And he showed us, I think in many ways, like, this doesn't work. And I don't mean that in a facetious way. I do think, you do need these explorers to go out. And yeah, you have a de Sade, and you and I can read about him and discuss it, but we don't have to try to, unless we feel so inclined. I guess some people have, people like Foucault and others in different sorts of ways, But, we don't feel inclined to go and have to do that because I think we can use our imagination and see like, well, as you said, it didn't seem to end up very well for him. Yeah. It doesn't seem to end up very well.
He died in 1947, but then by the 20 years later, in the mid-1960s, you have the Rolling Stones and Sympathy for the Devil, and all of a sudden, and the Beatles, this whole counterculture generation with rock music and sex and drugs, all of a sudden,
he was rediscovered.
Yeah, rediscovered and looked up to.
Famously, there was a sort of full-page spread about him in this magazine here in London called International Times. And the people involved in it were friends with the Beatles and all that. And they basically showed Crowley as a sort of proto-hippie in the sense that he was polymorphously perverse. He was sexual liberation, drug experimentation, social experiment, different ways of living and all that kind of thing. And then there was a book that came out by Richard Cavendish called The Black Arts. That was it was a very well written, intelligent book about the occult. This was sort of mid-decade, and you already had the other first half of the decade, where you have the sort of occult revival starting in about 1960 with the book Morning of the Magicians, being published in Paris, and then that kind of kickstarted this whole occult. And then you had Leary's thing happening too, so you had the sort of the new psychedelic mystery religion happening, and then all these things come, that I talk about in my book, Turn Up If You Mind. All these things come together, and Crowley becomes kind of a poster boy for, because the whole occult revival of the 60s was a revival, so it's going back to stuff from earlier times, and the stuff it's going back to was a revival of stuff in the first place.
But
too.
Crowley saw himself as sort of the prophet of a new age.
Well, this was this was the Book of the Law. There was a new age coming. The new age had started in 1904 when he had this revelation in Cairo, and it was going to be the age of force and fire. It was the age of the crowning conquering child. We had the age of the mother, Isis, and the age of the father, Osiris, and now it's the age of Horus. He was a child. He was free of all the law. And again, this is not too far distant from Giacomo de Fiore, the Christian sort of spiritual mystic, who he envisioned three ages, and there was the age of, it was like the Trinity and all that. So it's not too far away from stuff that, we can find in other places. But, Crowley predicted this coming, and it was going to be this age of liberation, the age of the will. And this was, but, it wasn't just everybody gets to do what they want. You have to develop your will. You have to, you have to master it and all that. And then and find your true will. This was the whole idea, to find, what you're, and again, it was it's more like a Taoistic sort of thing the more I think about it, because it was like you have a path. You have a way in the world, and the problem is our ways collide. But if each of us gets on our true way, then we all will somehow be able to go without bumping into each other. And Crowley was he was on his way. The problem is other people, they just getting in his way, as it were. And but so this was the sort of thing. If you found your true will, then you would be able to live. Well, this new age would be the age of those who were able to do that. And the slaves shall serve. Again, there was this whole idea that those who didn't master their true will, the masses and all that, they would somehow be happy, accommodating those who did and all this kind of thing. And so, it depends how you look at it. Some people say, that strikes me as a bit adolescent, but,
Another one of his phrases for which he's famous, one of his pithy statements is, and it always impressed me, every man and woman is a star.
Again, this is that idea. The stars have an orbit. From here, we don't see the stars, colliding, even though apparently they do every now and then. But, so it's Pythagorean, it's Platonic. Hermetic idea, there's a course, I'm sorry I'm moving around, there's an order, a course to things, and if each of us found our own orbit, our own natural course, then we would move in that kind of harmony and that kind of thing. And again, what's wrong with that? That's a good idea. Easier said than done. And I would say that in many ways that's sort of the aim of most kind of spiritual traditions or paths, in a sense, find your own real place in the world and all that kind of thing. I think with Crowley, his way of doing that was very disruptive. And not to say he was the only one. Again, there's a whole kind of canon of characters where that's the case. But it's a lovely, it is a wonderful phrase, and there's a wonderful story about him when he was in New York, and he took this magical retirement, and he went up the Hudson. And he stopped at an island. I forget the name of the island right now. But he had brought with him cans of paint and rope and tackle and all this kind of thing. And he somehow lowered himself over the cliffs. So he was facing the cliffs back to the river. And he painted that. Every man and every woman. So he was a graffiti artist as well, So he painted every man and every woman as a star. And so people going, boat going up the Hudson, they would see that. And I don't know if it's the case, but I wonder. In the book, I say there was that song by Sly and the Family Stone, "Everybody is a Star," that I think was either 69 or 70 or something like that. And I wondered if that was a kind of a Crowley idea that had seeped through.
Well, it does seem that now we're many, many decades since his death. It seems that he's become iconic in the sense of larger than life. He's become almost mythologized.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I think that image that, there's a couple, the one with his bald head, and he's very, he looks like Erich von Stroheim or something like that, and or the other one where he has the hood on with the shining pyramid and the sign of Pan. And I mean, I often wonder why, if you remember those old Warhol silk screens, I thought, wouldn't those make a great addition to that kind of thing? And you see T-shirts of that, you see posters and that kind of thing. So I think, he's been absorbed, and a lot of people know, just like many things, they know a vague reference. Oh, he's this magician guy and all that. And again, I'm the last person to be up to whatever contemporary music. For my sins, I don't pay attention to, but I do know at the time I was writing my book about Crowley that people like Jay-Z and Rihanna, or some of these others, that it was all about the Illuminati, and there's some videos where a duet that Will shows up and the Golden Dawn does, and a variety of other kinds of things, and Lady Gaga had something along those lines, and I guess Kanye West, is he in the Illuminati? Well, who knows? But I mean, so this stuff lives on, and again, I think it's from what I can gather, it's a different feel to it. It wasn't, you look back in the 60s, it was liberating. It was more about, what's new and wonderful for all, for everybody. Look at this new wonderful world that, if you knew about it, you could take part in it and all that. But this other, what I can gather from this rap hip hop, kind of world in it, it's more elitist, it's more, exclusive. It's like, the Illuminati, we belong to this. And and the whole thing that Crowley, he fits in with the whole bling kind of thing too. He loved wearing jewelry. He loved wearing, shows of power. Again, if you contrast him with someone like Madame Blavatsky, I mean, she had her own style of dressing, but she had no interest in any of the sort of mystical insignia or the different titles. I mean, Crowley collected titles, very different Masonic kinds of titles and all that. Blavatsky didn't care anything about any of that kind of stuff. So it's a very different, kinds of character there. But there was something, again, I think Crowley really liked, to show off that kind of thing. And he would, he would borrow money from people, and instead of living on it, he would go buy, some ruby ring or something like that, and then ask them for more money. And somehow that would seem like, well, it's perfectly all right. I mean, don't you see why? Kind of thing.
Well, it does strike me that it's interesting that people like Annie Besant or Rudolf Steiner, Crowley's contemporaries, really wanted to have nothing to do with him.
Again, I would think much like Yeats, that or his character, his reputation preceded him. Yeah. Although, oddly enough, Rudolf Steiner was a member of the OTO briefly before Crowley joined, and I write about that a little bit in my book about Steiner. But no, I mean, they just thought he was this odious kind of character, and he didn't have a good word. He didn't have a good word to say about any of them. I mean, even poor A.E. Waite, who was not brilliant, but a very good scholar of occult lore and Rosicrucianism and Kabbalah and all that, and the tarot and many other things. And he, as I said, he was the one who basically put Crowley on his path, but he never had a good word for him. After that, you can find these venomous passages in his confessions, and other people as well. And so, I mean, there is a story where he supposedly one time went to Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in Fontainebleau outside Paris. And this is when he was trying to kick his heroin habit. And Gurdjieff worked as a hypnotist for many years, where he actually did cure people of drug addiction. And so one version of the story is this news had got around to Crowley, or Crowley just wanted to check out see what Gurdjieff was doing. And again, there's different versions of it, but he goes. And in one version, he meets Crowley, and another version, he doesn't. The only sort of account that I know of that Crowley himself left was a sort of note about in his diary about it, and where he doesn't really talk about meeting Gurdjieff, but he meets one of Gurdjieff's sort of students there, and he shows him around and talks to him about it. But he does say something about, sounds like a tip-top man or something, which sounds, and in this other version of the story, they do meet, and Gurdjieff is very accommodating to him and treats him very well, all during his visit. And then at the end, he says, "Are you leaving now?" And he says, "Yes, I am." "You go." Yes. And they have that exchange for a bit. And then, "Okay, you're no longer guest," he said, "I'm no longer guest." And then he unleashes this, attack on Crowley, saying he was a dark, evil, bad man, and you go and never come here again. So James Webb tells that story in his book, The Harmonious Circle, but I've yet to find another reference to it, so I don't know.
I think it's also worth mentioning that Crowley was an inspiration to people like Kenneth Anger, the filmmaker, and I think Timothy Leary found inspiration in Crowley's autobiography.
Oh, well, Leary actually said that he was carrying on Crowley's work. And if one of his, Leary wrote quite a few biographies, and one of them is called Confessions of a Hope Fiend.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess that's a combination of Diary of a Drug Fiend and Crowley's Confessions. Uh-huh. And he said in an interview later, I think it was sometime in the 80s, where he talked about, Crowley's influence. And there is an account where he and a companion of his are in the North African desert, and they somehow wind up reincarnating Crowley and this poet named Victor Neuberg, who at some time in 1909, I believe, they evoked the demon Coronzon, who is this demon of confusion and darkness and all this kind of thing. And so Leary was sort of modeling himself on that, on Crowley's kind of thing for a while. And Kenneth Anger, of course, Kenneth Anger, the experimental filmmaker. He is fantastic film, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which is Crowleyan ceremony on film, basically. It's, if you've never seen it, it's incredibly rich colors. And the Scarlet Woman is in there. She's played by a woman named Marjorie Cameron, who is associated with Jack Parsons. She married Parsons. Is Parsons' widow, I believe, by the time the film was being made. And Anais Nin, the writer and a lover of Henry Miller, she's in it. And it's shot in this fantastic Hollywood mansion up in the Hollywood Hills. And yes, it's just this incredible sort of Crowleyan ceremony. And talk about jewels and bling and all that. It's just filled with that, filled with all color and different jeweled goblets. And, there's even scenes where people are swallowing jewels and necklaces and things of that sort. And there's Crowley informs, most of Anger's films. The big one was Lucifer's Rising, that took forever to be made. And people like Jimmy Page contributed to it, and others as well. And eventually, it came out with the soundtrack by fellow Bobby Beausoleil, who made a name for himself as being part of Charles Manson's family. Mm-hmm. And people like Marianne Faithfull in the film and all that, and it's full of the whole Crowleyan idea of the New Age coming and things of that sort. So, but you can even find if you go back into like the 30s, I mean there's Crowleyan characters or sort of evil magicians or evil characters based on him in films. There's a film called The Black Cat with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, and the Karloff character is based on Crowley.
Based on Crowley the person or Crowley the myth?
Well, the story. I mean, the
myth.
The earliest one. There was a film by a guy named Rex Ingram, and it's a silent film. It's called The Magician, and it's based on the Somerset Maugham novel. And the magician in it, Oliver Haddo, is actually based on Crowley because Maugham knew Crowley in Paris in around 1905 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there's so the character in there is this fictional character is based on Crowley, and then sort of different. I mean, The Devil Writes Out. That's like probably the most famous one. Maybe not to American audiences as much, but this was a Hammer British Hammer horror film made in the 1960s, Christopher Lee, and it's based on a novel by a fellow named Dennis Wheatley, who was sort of a pulp, kind of occult writer in England. And Wheatley knew Crowley, and how much he really understood magic and all that kind of thing's another story. But again, the magician. The evil magician character in the film is based on Crowley.
But when we started our interview, Gary, you made a point of saying you didn't believe Crowley was really an evil person.
I wouldn't say I would say he was a dark magician. That's how I characterize him, rather than a black magician. He's not a black magician, although some of the things he did. I mean, he did do some rather heinous things. I would say, and he acted in rather ignominious ways at times. I mean, maybe other people who write about him, they might find me judgmental. They might have a different way of interpreting it. That's all right. I mean,
some people will say you're too soft on him.
Oh yeah, too. I mean, the thing is, I'm trying. I mean, as I said, when I was an enthusiast when I first got into it. I mean, I was involved when I first moved to Los Angeles in the late 70s. I got involved in the OTO, and I got involved in a branch of the AA. And I later realized that this had links going back to people that actually knew Crowley in his last days in the 40s, and it was interesting for a while, but it just seems to me more of an Aleister Crowley fan club than anything else. But I did participate in some rituals and all that, and I did do a lot of work on my own and that kind of thing. And I gradually, but the thing is, I got tired of him. Yeah, because that's the thing, is that it's all this way. He talks about an enormous number of things, and he, visionary and the cosmos and all that. But it always, all the roads lead back to him, and I found that suffocating after a while. And so after a few years and reading everything, even the poetry and all that kind of thing, I gave up on it and left it. And then I didn't really pay too much attention to Crowley for quite some time until what I was saying in the beginning of the book. I saw that he was sort of being rehabilitated, and there were academic studies. I was more interested in why did he stay this kind of rock icon? I mean, in many ways it's obvious, because he was an extremist. He took everything to the extreme. So that's one reason why he stayed in this iconography when people like Blavatsky and Jung and others who people knew about in the 60s, late 60s or early 70s, they didn't really stay around as much. And I wanted to explore this whole philosophy, this liberationist philosophy, because I want to say, it didn't work for him, so why doesn't it work? And so that was part of it. But
my exposure to Crowley came in the 1970s in Berkeley, California, where there was a large occult community, and Crowley was discussed often. I mean, his name was in the air all the time, and I did get to meet a fellow that you wrote about, Grady McMurtry. Yeah.
All right.
Who was the head of the OTO, lived in Walnut Creek, California in those days, and I think was responsible for the publication in the 1960s of the Crowley Tarot deck.
Yeah, you're right. So what year would this have been?
1970, 71, 72.
Oh, that, okay. I mean, it was a bit later for me, about 70, 78.
Yeah.
I got involved. So, I mean, again, when you know the history, I mean, that in itself becomes fascinating.
I knew a fellow.
I was going to say, he was one of the last people, he was one of the people who was visiting him, in his last days and all that. So.
I knew a fellow back in those years who was very talented, creative pianist and composer, and unfortunately, was in and out of mental hospitals all the time, but he imagined that he was the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley, but he had all these songs about Crowley that he would perform at parties, like, is Aleister Crowley really dead? Did he do all those terrible things they said?
In bed, Well, I think that'd probably be a hit on YouTube now. So he's achieved this immortality, that he wanted. Yeah. And people are still talking about him.
Well, I guess there's a certain love in the culture for naughty boys.
Well, I guess, yeah. So these rebels who can kind of, in many ways, they live the lives that lots of people would have liked. Or they also give more morally minded people, a good target to aim their complaints and reservations at, and so on. And again, he's a character. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, you wonder if he didn't live this life of extremes.
And maybe he was something of a visionary when he talked about a new age of the conquering child.
But it's sort of like it's not as liberating, perhaps, as he might have wanted. I could think. There was a book many years ago by Robert Bly called The Sibling Society, and I haven't read it in years, but it just came into mind as you mentioned that. But I've thought of it before, and again, it was this whole idea that the whole idea of an adult has kind of been sort of worn down, and we're more like into being brothers and sisters kind of thing. This kind of one level kind of family sort of thing, where and that's sort of this kind of child, but it's also the child just sort of doesn't have to have the responsibilities of the adult, and the child doesn't have to have worries that the adult has. And this was the sort of thing that Crowley envisioned. But we all know that if there was a world of children out there, it just wouldn't. But then again, we know in the Bible, Jesus says, unless you become like children again. But it's not the irresponsible. I mean, it's not this kind of irresponsibility. And I don't mean to sound moralistic or puritanical, but I don't think in the Gospels when they're talking about becoming a child, there's this kind of innocence, or it's kind of return to yourself in some way. But I don't think it's the same kind of license, let's say, that I think unfortunately many people that get drawn to Crowley's philosophy see. I mean that's the thing that they see in it.
I think you make the point throughout your book that there is a sense in which his development was arrested, that he never became fully the person he might have been.
I think it goes back to his childhood. I think this combination of, on one hand, having this very restricted world, and at the same time feeling that you belong to this elite, because like the Jehovah's Witness, only the people who belong to the Plymouth Brethren were going to be saved from the apocalypse, which is imminent, and all that. And having this father who went around and preached, to the people, preached his message to them. And then, to have this reversal, where he was still doted upon. He said he grew up never having to, he never wanted for anything. He didn't know the value of anything because anything he wanted was there all the time. So I think I don't get the impression that he was punished that much, even when he was, a bad boy or kind of thing. And then he didn't have to work for anything. I mean, Crowley, as you say, it wasn't until his 40s. I don't think it was until his 40s that Crowley realized he had to sort of do something for a living. And this is when he turns to journalism. And he's writing, he's in America during World War I. And he winds up writing for a pro-German newspaper. It's difficult to make a living as a writer. I know, but there's a whole story behind that. He really was a spy working for British intelligence, and there's by now there's reams of stuff written about that. I keep an open mind about it. But yeah, he had so he didn't really have to struggle in his early days.
Well, Gary, we could keep going probably.
I know we keep going. I feel like there's lots of good things that we didn't get to say about him, and I hope all the people who are Crowley like him, Crowley devotees, they don't feel like all I'm saying about him is bad. That's not how I feel about him, but.
Okay. Many of the viewers on this YouTube channel are interested because of the parapsychological angle, and we hardly touched on it. Crowley himself was reputed to be very gifted. I think he knew how to make things happen. Yeah.
I say in this book and others, he somehow knew how to make synchronicities happen, which I think is more or less the essence of magic. I don't think he knew how he knew, but he somehow was able to throw himself into a state where things would happen around him.
Well, Gary Lachman, once again, a very enlightening discussion about a fascinating individual. Thank you so much for being with me.
Absolutely my pleasure, Jeffrey, and it's always a wonderful experience to be on, so I look forward to the next time.
Very good.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.